On May 14, 1852, every major newspaper in New Orleans carried some version of the same report. At the marble auction block of the elegant Maison Royale Hotel, a young man, just 23 years old, had sold for a price that shattered every known record in the city and, some whispered, across the entire South. They called him the most beautiful male slave ever brought to the Maison Royale auction floor. But what those papers did not print, what the auctioneers never admitted, what the city's elite only whispered about in private drawing rooms, was the secret that made his sale not just extraordinary, but impossible. 7 witnesses would later swear under oath that the young man standing on that platform could not have existed in the way the records described him, not because of what he looked like, but because of who he was. The city's most powerful families fought to own him. One of them succeeded. Within 3 months, that family would be quietly, but completely, destroyed. The official record of his sale was sealed by the Louisiana legislature in 1853 and has never been opened. Until now, almost no one has dared to ask the question that should have been obvious from the very beginning. Why would anyone pay a fortune for a man who was already, by law, free? Before we continue with the story of the Maison Royale Hotel and the young man, who should never have been on that block, I need to ask you something. If you're listening from Louisiana, Mississippi, or anywhere along the Gulf Coast, leave a comment telling me your state. Because what happened in New Orleans in 1850 may have echoed down into your own family's history in ways no one ever told you. And if you want to hear more stories like this stories they tried to bury, hit that subscribe button right now. The answer to that question does not begin in New Orleans. It begins in a place that doesn't appear on any modern map. A plantation whose land has been parceled, renamed, and half swallowed by the river. A place once known as Belle-Rivière Plantation. Belle-Rivière lay 43 miles upriver from New Orleans. A sprawling sugar empire that had belonged to the Vaucouleurs family since 1791. By 1852, it was one of the most profitable operations in Louisiana, producing over 800 hogsheads of sugar a year and employing, if that word can be used at all, 217 enslaved people. The main house was a monument to Creole grandeur. 3 stories of whitewashed brick and stucco, broad galleries wrapped around each level, supported by columns shipped at great expense from France in 1803. An avenue of live oaks lined the river approach, their branches heavy with Spanish moss that fell in gray curtains, forming a tunnel of shifting green shadow. Visitors described the walk as either enchanting or oppressive, depending on their temperament. The Vaucouleurs were Creole aristocracy, French-speaking Catholics, who traced their lineage back to Normandy and liked to remind anyone listening that they had been in Louisiana before it was American. They spoke French at home, attended Mass in Latin, and married within a small, carefully surveilled circle of families, whose surnames appeared in the earliest French colonial records. To be Creole, in their eyes, was to belong to a separate, superior world with its own rules, its own hierarchies, its own complicated understanding of race and status. That didn't quite align with the strict black and white binaries preferred by the newer American arrivals. The master of Belle-Rivière in 1852 was Monsieur Adrien Vaucouleurs, 56 years old, widowed for 8 years, and by all accounts a man of refined tastes and meticulous habits. He kept his accounts in thick leather-bound ledgers, every figure written in his precise sloping hand, every column of numbers checked and rechecked. He attended Mass every Sunday at St. Augustine's in New Orleans, always in the same pew his father had purchased in 1802. He belonged to the right clubs, invested in the right banks, and married his 3 daughters to the right families. His reputation was spotless, a man who honored his contracts, paid his debts, and, as he liked to say, treated his slaves with proper Christian consideration. His younger brother was another matter entirely. Christophe Vaucourt had always been the charming one, the handsome one, the one who could talk his way into any salon and out of any responsibility. While Adrienne learned the brutal arithmetic of sugar cultivation and plantation management, Christophe learned poetry, piano, and the art of spending money that did not belong to him. When their father died in 1821, he left Belle-Rivière entirely to Adrienne, granting Christophe only a fixed allowance with a single condition. He was never to interfere in the family business. Christophe, 24 at the time, took the allowance and was on a ship to Paris within 6 months. For 6 years, he sent cheerful letters home describing Parisian life, the theatres, the salons, the cafes where men debated philosophy and politics until dawn. Adrienne paid his brother's debts in silence and sent extra money. When the letters became a little too desperate, it was, he decided, a small price to pay for peace. Then, in 1827, Christophe did something Adrienne had not expected. He got married. The letter announcing the marriage arrived in October in a stiff, foreign-smelling envelope, along with a small daguerreotype that must have cost more than a month's rent. The woman in the image was young, perhaps 20, with fine features and dark eyes that seemed to look straight through the camera lens. Her dress was simple but elegantly cut, and her hair was arranged in the latest Parisian style. On the back, in Christophe's looping, theatrical hand, was written, "Klein Moreau Vaucourt, my wife, your sister-in-law. You would love her, mon frère." What Christophe did not mention, but what the daguerreotype made obvious to anyone who knew how to see, was that Klein carried African ancestry. Not much. In Paris, she might easily have been taken for Mediterranean or perhaps from the south of France. But Adrienne recognized the signs at once. The tone of her skin, the faint texture visible in the hair beneath the elaborate styling, the subtle geometry of her features. In Paris, it was unremarkable. In Louisiana, it was catastrophic. Adrienne's reply was brief and terminal. Christophe was no longer welcome at Belle-Rivière. His allowance would continue, but only on the condition that he never returned to Louisiana and never again involved the family name in such irregular alliances. The marriage was not recognized. Any children born of it would not be recognized. As far as the Vaucourt family was concerned, Christophe had died in Paris in 1827. Christophe's answer took 4 months to arrive. It was as curt as Adrienne's. "I understand. I am sorry for the disappointment. My son was born last month. His name is Lucien Baptiste. He will never know he had an uncle in Louisiana." For 24 years, Christophe honored that exile. Adrienne heard nothing directly from his brother, only once a year. A dry confirmation from a Parisian bank that Christophe was still alive and receiving his allowance. Adrienne married, had 3 daughters, became one of the most successful planters in the state, and buried his wife after a fever took her in 1844. He never admitted, outside of his immediate household, that he had ever had a brother at all. Then, in March of 1852, everything changed with a single letter. It arrived on a Tuesday, forwarded from a hotel in New York City. The paper thinned from being handled too much. The ink slightly blurred where a tired hand had pressed too hard. The handwriting was unmistakably Christophe's, but shakier, more fragile. The letters occasionally trailing off as if the strength behind them had failed. Before each stroke was finished, the message was short but devastating. Consumption tuberculosis diagnosed 6 months earlier. Now in its final stages. The doctors gave him perhaps 3 months. He had one request, one last favor to ask of the brother who had financed his exile for 25 years, while pretending he no longer existed. "My son, Lucien Baptiste, is 23. He has studied literature and philosophy for 3 years at the Sorbonne. He speaks French, English, Italian, and Latin. He reads Greek. He plays the piano beautifully. He has never done manual labor in his life, and I fear he would be quite hopeless at it. His mother died of cholera in 1848. As my health declined, he has survived by tutoring and small clerical work. But he is alone in the world now. Adrienne, when I am gone, he will have nothing. No family in Paris. No connections. No money. I have spent everything, including what should have been his inheritance, on doctors who can do nothing but soften the pain as I die. I am asking you to take him in not as family. I know that is impossible for you, but as something useful. A secretary, perhaps. You have always needed someone capable of handling correspondence in multiple languages. He is gifted with numbers and has a beautiful hand. He would be useful to you. And he is my son. He is the only truly good thing I have done in my life. Please, Monfa, I am begging you. Adrienne read the letter 3 times standing alone in his study, the afternoon light slanting through the tall French windows and pooling in gold on the polished wood floor. His first impulse was to refuse outright. The young man was indeed his brother's son, but also the son of a woman, whose very existence in the Vaucourt family tree would be a scandal. In Paris, that might matter little. In Louisiana, it meant everything. To acknowledge Lucien as kin meant inviting questions. Questions meant speculation. Speculation meant danger. But Adrien was, above all, a practical man. And as he stood there, the river murmuring faintly beyond the oaks and the sugar fields blazing green in the distance, an idea began to take shape. An idea that, in any moral universe, should have horrified him. That it did not said everything about the man he had become. He sat at his desk, dipped his pen, and wrote his answer. He would accept Lucien at Belle-Rivière. The young man should book passage on the next ship to New Orleans and then take a steamboat upriver to the plantation. Adrien would meet him there and determine appropriate arrangements. He signed the letter, sealed it, and sent it express to New York. Then he sat alone in his study for a long time, staring at the ledgers and the window and his own hands, thinking about profit, thinking about opportunity, thinking about the strange ways fate sometimes delivered both at once. Lucien Baptiste Vaucourt arrived at Belle-Rivière on Thursday, April 3, 1852, on a day that was unseasonably hot, even for Louisiana. The steamboat from New Orleans pulled in at the plantation's private landing at 4 o'clock in the afternoon. Adrien was waiting on the dock with his overseer, a hard-jawed man named Harlan Gage, and 3 of his most trusted house servants. What stepped off that boat made everyone present go very, very still. Lucien Baptiste was, without question, the most physically striking young man any of them had ever seen. He was tall, slightly over 6 feet, with a slender, aristocratic build that spoke of regular meals and a lifetime touched by manual labor. His hair was black and slightly wavy, worn a bit longer than American fashion, but entirely at home in Paris. His eyes were an unusual shade of green gold, turning almost amber in certain light, framed by lashes so long they would have made half the women in New Orleans jealous. His features were almost unnervingly symmetrical. High cheekbones, a straight, elegant nose, a finely shaped mouth that looked as if it belonged more on a portrait than on a living man. His skin was pale, not the pinkish, ruddy pallor of the Anglo-American planters, but the smooth, even tone of fine porcelain with the faintest warmth beneath, like someone with Mediterranean blood rather than African. He could have passed as white in any city in America. In truth, he looked more European than Adrien himself, more refined, more polished, as if he'd been carefully crafted rather than merely born. He was also unmistakably Christophe's son. The resemblance struck Adrien like a physical blow. The same elegant bone structure, the same lightness of movement, the same easy charisma that made people want to look at him. For a moment, Adrien felt something he had expected. Grief. Grief for a brother he claimed not to have. Lucien descended the gangplank carrying a single leather trunk. It had clearly been expensive once, but the corners were worn, the handle darkened by years of use. He wore a dark wool traveling suit, well cut but showing signs of careful repair, a patch at one elbow, mismatched buttons, cuffs that had already been turned once. His boots were polished but race-old. Everything about him suggested what the French sometimes called genteel poverty, the kind that clung fiercely to appearances while quietly starving behind closed doors. When he reached the bottom of the gangplank, he set his trunk down and looked directly at Adrienne. For a long moment, neither man moved. They studied one another. Adrienne seeing a ghost of the past. Lucien seeing the uncle who had exiled his father from his homeland. Then Lucien extended his hand. "Monsieur Vaucourt," he said in perfect, unaccented French, his voice low and cultivated. "I am Lucien Baptiste. Thank you for receiving me. I know this cannot be easy for you. It is not easy for me either." The tone was polite, but not servile, respectful, but entirely without fear. He spoke as someone accustomed to equality, or at least to believing he deserved it. Adrienne did not take his hand. He let his gaze travel slowly over the young man's clothing, posture, and face, searching for anything that might betray his mother's ancestry. Under Louisiana law, a single drop of African blood defined a person as colored. That definition dictated where they could walk, where they could sit, who they could marry, whether they could be owned. Adrienne looked hard, but there was nothing obvious. Lucien looked white. More than white, he looked aristocratic. That made him valuable. It also made him dangerous. "Follow me," Adrienne said at last, in French. He turned and began walking toward the main house, without waiting to see if Lucien obeyed. Gage stepped forward and lifted the trunk without a word. The 3 house servants, 2 women and 1 man, all light-skinned Creoles trusted in the main house, stood back and watched. One of the women, Elise Marie, would later tell others that the young man walked up that shell-covered path, like a man going to his own execution. Steady, calm, but with eyes that had already understood something terrible was coming. They did not go into the main house. Adrienne led Lucien around it to a smaller cabin at the back, one of several used to house those enslaved people who worked inside the house, but were not considered trustworthy enough to sleep in it. They were too valuable to be quartered with the field hands, but not valuable enough to have an actual room. The cabin was simple but decent. 1 room with a narrow bed, a table, a chair, a washstand, and a small fireplace. In April, the fireplace was useless, but in winter it would almost feel kind. "If you are still here in winter," Adrienne said lightly, almost as an afterthought, "this will be your quarters." He continued, still in French, "I will send someone with food and water. Tomorrow morning, we will discuss your duties. You will not leave this cabin tonight. You will not speak to anyone. Do you understand?" Lucien looked slowly around the cramped room and then back at his uncle. "I understand," he said quietly. "May I ask a question?" "No," Adrienne replied. "Tomorrow." He turned and left, Gage on his heels, the door closing behind them with a decisive wooden thud. The sound of a key turning in a lock followed a moment later. That night, Elise Marie brought a tray of rice, beans, a small piece of chicken, and bread. She knocked gently, and when Lucien opened the door she kept her eyes low, as if afraid to see too much. "Thank you," he said in French, and she looked up, startled. "You speak French?" "My father's language," he answered. "You serve my uncle. You are his nephew?" she asked in the same low French, glancing toward the main house as if the walls themselves could hear. "My father's brother," Lucien said. "Does he know about your mother?" she asked. Lucien's smile was quick and without humor. "Yes, he knows." Elise Marie studied his face for a long moment, seeing both the privilege and the danger written there. Then she said very softly, "Be careful. Monsieur Adrien is not a cruel man, but he is a practical one. And practical men sometimes do terrible things, because they make sense in their ledgers. She left before Lucien could reply. He stood in the doorway, watching her walk back toward the main house, and felt the first true stirrings of fear since leaving Europe. Not fear of whips or chains. Something colder. The fear of becoming a problem to be solved. A line item to be adjusted. A thing instead of a person. He ate because he was hungry, then opened his trunk. Inside were a few changes of clothing, worn but carefully folded several books, including a dog-eared volume of Montaigne's essays, and a French Bible, a bundle of his father's letters tied with string, and, most important, a leather portfolio. Inside that portfolio lay his life, his Paris birth certificate, listing his parents as Christophe Vaucourt and Klein Moreau, both free, his baptismal record from Glaise Saint-Sulpice, his completion certificate from the Lycée Henry Ivy, letters of recommendation from two professors of the Sorbonne. Everything was in French. Everything bore real seals, real signatures. Everything pointed to one undeniable fact. He was a free man, born free, raised free, educated free. He spread the documents on the small table and stared at them for a long time. Then, guided by an instinct he could not quite name, he took out a blank sheet of paper and made an inventory. He listed each document, the issuing authority, the dates, the exact wording of each crucial line. He wrote in a small, neat script, filling 2 pages with the details of his own paper existence. Then he folded the inventory and slid it into the hollow of the Montaigne's spine, where no casual hand would ever notice it. His father had told him once, in this world, Lucien, the only thing between you and disaster is often the right piece of paper. Guard your papers like your soul, because in many ways they are your soul. Lucien fell asleep still dressed, lying on top of the thin blanket, listening to the strange night sounds of Louisiana cicadas in the trees, frogs in the ditches, the faint, sorrowful singing from the quarters, and beneath it all the ceaseless murmur of the Mississippi, invisible in the dark but always present. The next morning, Adrien summoned Lucien to his study at 8 o'clock. The room was impressive, the kind of space designed to make visitors aware of their place. Floor-to-ceiling shelves lined 3 walls, mostly filled not with literature but ledgers. A massive desk of cypress dominated the room, positioned to command a view of the sugar fields through tall windows. Portraits of stern-faced Vaucourt ancestors hung on the walls, their painted eyes following everything. Adrien sat behind the desk. Lucien stood in front of it. The arrangement made their positions brutally clear. "You have your papers?" Adrien asked in French. "Yes, monsieur. I will need to examine them for your protection," Adrien said mildly. "There are many forged documents in circulation. I want to be sure yours are authentic." Lucien hesitated. Every instinct in him screamed that handing over those papers was the same as handing over his freedom. But he also understood what his situation really was. He was in a slave state where his appearance could help him or condemn him, depending on who asked the questions. He knew almost no English, had no money, no friends, no work, and a father likely already dead in a city far away. He had nowhere else to go, so he went back to the cabin, retrieved the portfolio, and handed it over. For 20 minutes, Adrien examined each document carefully, occasionally jotting a note into a small black book on his desk. When he was finished, he placed all of Lucien's papers in the top drawer of the desk and turned a key. "They appear authentic," he said. "I will keep them here, where they will be safe. Now, let us discuss your situation." He spoke slowly, in the careful tone of a man explaining something to a child, or to someone who did not quite understand how the world really worked. "You are my brother's son, and I promised him I would see you provided for," Adrien began. "However, you must understand the difficulties your presence creates. Your mother was a woman of color. Under Louisiana law, that makes you a man of color, whatever you may look like. If I were to acknowledge you as my nephew as family, it would create impossible complications. My daughters are married to respectable houses. My standing in this community rests on reputation and careful, delicate relationships. I cannot put all that at risk. Lucien said nothing, but behind his back his hands curled into fists, so tight the knuckles went white. However, Adrien continued, I am not without compassion. He actually smiled as he said it. I am willing to give you shelter, food, and appropriate work here at Belle-Rivière. You will serve as my personal secretary. You will handle my correspondence, especially anything requiring French. You will keep certain records. You will live in the cabin where you slept last night. In exchange, you will not speak of your father, or Paris, or your documentation. As far as anyone is concerned, you are simply Lucien, a light-skinned slave I acquired in a private sale. Do you understand? The word slave hung in the air between them like smoke. Lucien felt something in him bend, then twist under a pressure he had never imagined. I understand that you are asking me to pretend to be enslaved, he said carefully, even though I have legal proof that I am free. I am asking you to be practical, Adrien replied. You are in Louisiana now, not Paris. French papers mean very little here. Without my protection, you would be vulnerable to suspicion, to arrest, even to enslavement by someone less scrupulous than I am. Many free people of color have been dragged into bondage because they could not prove, in the right way, at the right moment, who they were. I am offering you safety by making me your slave, Lucien said. Adrien spread his hands. By allowing you to live as if you were enslaved while knowing that you are not. It is a performance, nothing more. Unpleasant, yes, but temporary. In time, when things are calmer, I may arrange something else for you, perhaps passage north, or even back to France. For now, this is what I can offer. Lucien understood exactly what was happening. This was not protection. This was erasure. An inconvenient nephew was being converted into a convenient asset. A potential scandal turned into profit. A living human being translated into a line on the ledger. And if I refuse? He asked quietly. Then I cannot help you, Adrien said, his tone just as calm. I will return your papers and give you enough money to reach New Orleans. After that, you are on your own in a place where your appearance will invite questions you cannot safely answer. You have no English, no money, no connections. Where will you go? What will you do? He was right, and they both knew it. Lucien could refuse and cling to his pride all the way into ruin. Or he could submit and hope that his uncle's vague promises of a better future were not entirely lies. I understand, Lucien said at last, and the words tasted like ashes. When do I begin? Today, Adrien answered. He opened a fresh ledger, dipped his pen, and spoke as he wrote. Acquired April 3, 1852. One male, age 23. Name: Lucien. No surname. Light-skinned. Literate and educated. Suitable for domestic service. Private transaction. No bill of sale available. Estimated value: $2,000. He looked up and closed the book with a soft, final sound. There. Now you exist in my records, and your presence here is explained. Your papers are secure in my desk. Your father's allowance will continue to be paid into the Paris account until his death afterward. It will cease. You will work as my secretary and, in exchange, you will have food, shelter, and safety. This is, I think, the best arrangement either of us can reasonably hope for. Lucien felt something in him shift again. It was not the clean break of a bone, but the slow cracking of something deeper. Standing there in that polished study, watching Adrien transform him from person to property with a few strokes of a pen, he understood that he had crossed into another world. In that world, The documents locked in Adrienne's desk meant nothing compared to the single line just written in the plantation ledger. "May I ask one more question, monsieur?" he said. "Of course. Did you ever actually intend to help me?" Lucien asked. "Or was this your plan from the moment you read my father's letter?" Adrienne studied him for a long moment. Something flickered across his face: regret, perhaps, or perhaps just a trick of the morning light. "I intended," he said finally, "to do what was practical for both of us. Now, let me show you where you will work." For 5 weeks, the arrangement operated exactly as Adrienne had imagined. Lucien served as his secretary, working in a small side office that opened into the main study. He translated letters from wine merchants in Bordeaux, silk traders in Lyon, bankers in Paris. He maintained certain sensitive ledgers that Adrienne deliberately kept in French, knowing that most Americans, including his own overseer, would be unable to read them. He advised on investments and contracts. His Sorbonne education proved unexpectedly useful in navigating complex financial instruments and foreign markets. He was brilliant at the work, which should have surprised no one. Adrienne began to consult him on matters far beyond mere translation, asking his opinion on the reliability of certain partners, the stability of distant governments, the likely impact of European revolutions on American sugar prices. Lucien answered precisely, never forgetting his position, always couching his recommendations in deferential language, but his mind was obvious. He was not simply useful, he was invaluable. The other enslaved people at Belle-Rivière didn't know what to make of him. He looked white, yet slept in the cabins. He spoke French with the polished Parisian clarity of a professor, yet was whipped in the ledger as a piece of property. He was educated, but chained to the plantation by law and deceit. He did not fit any category they had. Some, like Elise Marie, Jonas the stable hand, and an older woman named Tante Sabine, who ran the kitchen, were quietly kind to him. They brought extra food, gave warnings when Adrienne was in a foul mood, and coached him in the invisible rules of plantation life. Others avoided him. A man who was almost white, but enslaved, made them uneasy like a mirror that reflected the arbitrary cruelty of the world too clearly. Lucien accepted kindness when it came, but never presumed upon it. He spent most evenings alone in his cabin, reading his few books, writing letters in careful French to his father in New York letters he knew would likely never be read by the man they were addressed to. "I am safe," he wrote. "I work as a secretary. Uncle Adrien has been generous in his way. Please do not worry." He never mailed those letters. He folded them and kept them with the others, like prayers that did not need to reach heaven to be heard. Adrien had made one critical miscalculation. He had assumed that Lucien's beauty and intellect would remain a private asset, something that existed entirely within the boundaries of Belle-Rivière. He had not considered what would happen when he took Lucien into New Orleans itself. The trip took place on Wednesday, May 7th. Adrien needed to meet with several business partners to finalize arrangements for the coming harvest, and he decided almost on impulse to bring Lucien along. Lucien could take notes, translate, and demonstrate Adrien's sophistication. "Look," Adrien could say without saying it, "I have a secretary who speaks 4 languages and can quote Voltaire." They traveled by steamboat, arriving at the New Orleans docks around 10 in the morning. The levee was at its loudest and brightest. Ships of every size and origin crowding the river, carts rattling over cobblestones, vendors shouting, enslaved laborers hauling cargo under the eyes of overseers. Adrien had his meetings at his private club and into stately homes, each conversation circling the same orbit: contracts, prices, credit, shipping schedules. Lucien stood where he was told, silent until he was asked to translate a phrase or explain a point in smoother French. Everywhere they went, the reaction was the same. People stared. Women found excuses to pass close to where he stood, lingering just a heartbeat too long. Men watched him with the evaluating eyes they usually reserved for finely bred horses or imported furniture. Conversations faltered as he entered a room, not because he interrupted, but because his presence rearranged the air. At the third meeting, hosted in the elegant home of a commission merchant named Philippe Larocque, the merchant's wife approached Adrienne during a pause in discussions. "Monsieur Vaucourt," she said in French, "forgive my bluntness, but I must ask, that young man who attends you, he is your property?" Adrienne had been expecting this question all day. "A recent acquisition," he replied with studied indifference. "He serves as my secretary." "He is remarkable," Madame Larocque said bluntly. "I have never seen a slave with such an appearance." "From where did you acquire him?" "A private transaction," Adrienne said vaguely. "From an estate near Baton Rouge." "Would you consider offers?" Another woman's voice cut in. This was Madame Hunfournier, a wealthy widow known for a fashionable boarding house in the Garden District, and an entire staff of light-skinned house servants that caused endless gossip. "I would pay very well for a young man of such qualities," she said, her eyes resting on Lucien with proprietary hunger. Adrienne demurred, insisting Lucien was too valuable to part with. But the question, "would you consider offers?" lodged itself in his mind like a splinter. All the way back upriver, Adrienne turned it over and over. How much was Lucien worth? Not only as a secretary, but as a symbol and ornament of wealth and power for some grand house in the city. That night, after Lucien had retired to his little cabin, Adrienne sat in his study with pen, paper, and numbers. He had entered Lucien's value in his ledger as $2,000, already high, but based on the reactions in New Orleans, the way conversations had bent around Lucien, the way eyes had followed him, Adrienne began to believe he could demand far more. 3,000, 4, perhaps more still. The more he thought about it, the more sense it made. Lucien's presence at Belle-Rivière was becoming complicated. He was too distinctive, too memorable. His education and bearing unsettled other enslaved people and drew too much attention from visitors. Sooner or later, someone might ask the wrong question, or recognize him, or connect him to the Vaucourt name in an inconvenient way. Better to sell him in a setting where his extraordinary nature would be transformed into profit and paper, somewhere public and respectable. The Maison Royale Hotel conducted slave auctions 6 days a week and had done so for years. Selling Lucien there would not only be profitable, it would be prestigious. The kind of sale that became a story in itself. On May 8th, Adrienne began making arrangements. Lucien learned about the sale on Sunday, May 10th. He was reading his worn copy of Montaigne when the cabin door opened without warning. Adrienne entered with Gage and one of the male house servants. The presence of 3 men told Lucien everything he needed to know. Something had shifted. "I have decided to sell you," Adrienne said without preamble, in French. "There is an auction at the Maison Royale on May 14th. You will be presented there." Lucien stood slowly. The book slipped from his hands and hit the floor. "You gave me your word that this was temporary," he said. "That you would help me leave Louisiana." "And I will," Adrienne replied calmly, "by seeing you placed in a good household here in New Orleans. You will live in the city. You will work indoors. You will be surrounded by culture. In many ways, it is an improvement." "I am not a slave to be sold," Lucien said, his voice shaking despite his best efforts to control it. "I am your brother's son. I have papers proving I am free." "You have papers that I am safeguarding," Adrienne corrected gently. "And you are forgetting how complicated your position really is. Your mother's blood defines you under our law. Whatever Paris said you were, Louisiana does not agree. Without documentation of her status, documentation you do not possess your own freedom is a question, not a fact. I am protecting you by maintaining the fiction that you are mine." Otherwise, anyone could seize you. My mother was free, Lucien said, louder now. She married my father legally, in Paris. I was born free. The documents prove this. Your mother was a woman of color, Adrienne said flatly. Whatever her situation in France, in Louisiana, that fact would place you in a precarious category. Here, questions of status are settled by who holds the paper and who the courts believe. And I, he added quietly, I am far more believable in a Louisiana court than you are. Lucien's breath came unsteadily. Please, he whispered, do not do this. My father trusted you. He begged you to protect me. And I am, Adrienne said. You will cooperate, or I will have you restrained and sent under guard. The choice is yours. Lucien looked at the three men in the room. Adrienne with his cold eyes, Gage with his heavy hands, the house servant staring at the floor. There was nothing to be won by fighting. If he ran, the dogs and the river and the miles of swamp would take him. I will cooperate, he said finally. Good, Adrienne replied. We leave for New Orleans on the 13th. I suggest you sleep. This sail will determine your future. Present yourself well. They left, locking the door behind them. Lucien heard the key turn, heard their footsteps fade. Then he was alone. In 4 days, he would be standing on an auction block. He sat on the edge of the narrow bed, his body trembling. Not with fear now, but with a rage so white-hot it scared him. He wanted to overturn the table, smash the chair, and tear the mattress open with his hands. But destroying what little he had would change nothing. Instead, he did the only thing that felt like action. He took out paper and began to write. For 3 hours he wrote, so tightly and carefully that his hand cramped, documenting everything that had happened since he arrived in Louisiana. His reception at Belle-Rivière, the conversation where Adrienne confiscated his papers, the entry in the ledger that transformed him into property, the trip to New Orleans, the decision to sell him. He wrote in the formal, legal French he had learned at the Sorbonne, leaving no room for ambiguity. When he finished, he addressed the letter to the French consulate in New Orleans. He had no idea whether they would help, or even claim jurisdiction, but they were the only authority he could think of that might recognize him as something other than merchandise. He folded the letter and hid it where he had hidden his inventory before, in the hollow spine of the Montaigne volume. He had no way to send it, but he had at least fixed the truth on paper. The next morning, the cabin door was unlocked. Gage brought food and told him he was free to walk inside the plantation boundaries, but under no circumstances was he to go near the landing or the road. Lucien drifted through that day in a strange suspended state, moving like a ghost through the fields and trees, memorizing the shape of Belle-Rivière as if he might never see it again. On May 12th, Jonas found him near the stables and approached carefully. I heard what's happening, Jonas said in French, keeping his voice barely above a whisper. I'm sorry. Lucien looked at him, the man who had brought him extra water on the hottest days, who had shown him how to read the moods of Gage and Adrienne. Will you do something for me? Lucien asked. If I can. Lucien fetched the letter from his cabin and pressed it into Jonas' hands. After the auction, he said. Not before. After. Take this to the French consulate on Chartres Street. Give it to anyone there and tell them it is urgent. Can you do that? Jonas turned the letter over once, then tucked it inside his shirt. You think it will change anything? He asked. I don't know, Lucien admitted, but I have to try. Jonas nodded. He'll do it. Day after they sell you. Why are you asking me? Lucien hesitated, then said, because you still look at me like I'm a person. Jonas smiled, though it was a tired smile. Sometimes doing the right thing is all we have left, he said, even when it doesn't fix much. On May 13th, Adrienne, Gage, and Lucien traveled to New Orleans by steamboat. They arrived in the evening and lodged at the Maison Royale Hotel itself. Adrienne took a comfortable room upstairs. Lucien was housed on the ground floor in a secure chamber used for valuable property, a clean, window-barred room with a bed, a wash basin, and a locked door. It was not a cell, but it was not a guest room either. Lucien did not sleep that night. He sat on the edge of the bed and traced, in his mind, the chain of events that had brought him from Paris to this chamber. His mother, dying of cholera in 1848, had told him almost nothing about her own family, only that she had been alone in Paris when she met Christophe, that she had loved him despite everything, that she had never regretted the marriage even when it cost her the people she had left behind. His father, now likely dead in New York, had spent 25 years in exile rather than give up his wife. Adrienne had taken that same son and turned him into merchandise. Sometime in the deep hours of that hot May night, Lucien made a decision. If he was going to be sold, he would not go silently. The morning of Friday, May 14th, dawned bright and already heavy with heat. By 9 o'clock, the great rotunda of the Maison Royale was crowded. Buyers, spectators, and the idly curious pressed together in a ring around the raised marble platform. Beneath the soaring dome, the Maison Royale had sold everything from furniture to jewels to human beings on that platform. Slaves had been auctioned there so often that the stone itself seemed to remember their footsteps. Adrienne arrived early with Gage and Lucien. Lucien had been dressed carefully. A white linen shirt that set off his pallor, well-cut dark trousers, polished boots. His hair had been trimmed and combed back from his face. He wore no jewelry, no ornament of any kind, nothing to distract from the spectacle of him. When they stepped into the rotunda at 10 o'clock, the effect was immediate. Conversations stopped. Heads turned. Women stared openly. Men leaned forward in their chairs like gamblers, seeing a winning hand. The auctioneer that day was a professional named Pierre Morand, a man who had presided over thousands of such sales. Even he hesitated for half a heartbeat when he saw Lucien. Rumor had already spread through the city's elite that something extraordinary was to be sold that morning. The advertisement Adrienne had placed in the papers had been deliberately vague but provocative. A rare offering. Male domestic servant of exceptional qualities, educated, multilingual, suitable for only the finest household. Those who knew how to read such codes had come prepared to spend very serious money. At 10:30, Morin struck his gavel and the auction began. He welcomed the crowd in English, then repeated himself in French. "We present today," he announced, "on behalf of Monsieur Adrien Vaucourt of Belle-Rivière plantation, a young man of singular quality. He represents the very finest domestic service capacity available in our market." Lucien was led up onto the platform by Gage. He walked steadily, each step deliberate. When he reached the center of the platform, he stood absolutely still with his hands at his sides and his gaze fixed on some invisible point. In the middle distance, in the bright light pouring down from the dome, he looked almost unreal. His skin glowed faintly. His amber eyes caught the light. Every line of his face was smooth and perfectly defined. He looked like a portrait come to life, except that portraits did not stand on auction blocks. He looked white. He stood among the enslaved. He looked wealthy. He wore a shirt and trousers that any field hand might claim. He looked educated. He was being priced like livestock. Morin began his formal description. Age, 23 years, he said. Speaks French, English, Italian, and Latin. Literate in all four tongues. Experienced as secretary and clerk. Capable in bookkeeping, correspondence, and translation. Of gentle temperament. Suitable for the most refined household. Health. Certified excellent. Minimum bid. $2,000. The first bid came before Morand had finished the sentence. $2,200. Called a man in the front row. $2,500. Someone else countered. $3,000. The crowd stirred. The numbers were climbing too quickly to be a simple purchase. This was already a competition. 3,500, said a woman's voice, clear, firm, carrying. It was Madame Fournier. 4,000, responded Larocque, his jaw tight. Adrien watched from the edge of the platform, his heart beating faster with each new figure. He had been right. Lucien was worth far more than he had written in the ledger. The numbers rose like a fever. 4,500. 5,000. 5,500. At $6,000, many bidders dropped out altogether. At 7,000, only two serious voices remained. Madame Fournier and Monsieur Larocque, trading numbers like blows. 7,500, Fournier said. 8,000, Larocque snapped. 8,500. 9,000. The rotunda had gone almost silent. No one had ever seen a domestic servant sell for such a sum. This was no longer about practicality. It was about pride, power, and spectacle. At $10,000, Fournier's composure wavered. Morin turned to Larocque. 10,500, he suggested. Larocque hesitated. $10,000 was madness. But so was losing. Before he could speak, Fournier cut across him, her voice hard as glass. 11,000. The sound moved through the crowd like a shock wave. Even Morin faltered. 11,000 for one man. Morin turned slowly to Larocque. Monsieur. Larocque's fingers twitched. His mouth tightened. He said nothing. For a fraction of a second, the entire room held its breath. That was the moment Lucien had been waiting for. He took one breath, then spoke three words. Je suis libre. I am free. He did not shout. His voice was almost conversational, but the acoustics of the rotunda carried it perfectly. Silence snapped back into the room like a whip. Several people gasped. Others frowned, uncertain they had heard correctly. Adrien went ashen, then flushed an ugly red. Gage took a step toward Lucien, but Morin lifted a hand sharply, stopping him. You are not permitted to speak, Morin said, his voice tight. Silence. Lucien turned his head and looked directly at the auctioneer. When he spoke again, his voice was louder, clear enough that every person in the hall could hear each word. My name, he said, in French, is Lucien Baptiste Vaucourt. I am the son of Christophe Vaucourt and the nephew of Adrien Vaucourt. I was born free in Paris, France, on March 12, 1829. I am a French citizen, with documentation of my birth and my free status. I arrived in Louisiana at my uncle's invitation. When I came to Belle-Rivière, he confiscated my legal papers and fraudulently entered me in his records as a slave. Under both French law and Louisiana law, I cannot be legally enslaved. This sale is a fraud, and everyone participating in it, the seller, the buyers, and the auctioneer, is complicit in an illegal act. The silence that followed was complete. For one long, suspended heartbeat, the rotunda might have been carved from stone. Then the noise came. Adrien lunged toward the platform, shouting in rapid French that Lucien was mad, that he was the son of a slave named Klein who had been indulged with lessons, and had invented a fantasy of Parisian birth. Morin stared down at Lucien, all his professional composure gone. He looked from the young man to Adrien to the crowd, calculating not just morality, but danger. Lawyers in the front rows were already arguing. Some were shouting that the auction must be stopped until the claim could be investigated. Others insisted that a slave's testimony was worthless, that continuing the sale was perfectly lawful. Madame Fournier had gone pale. She was speaking rapidly to a man beside her, almost certainly her attorney. Larocque was demanding to see some sort of documentation, throwing his hands in the air. And then, in the middle of that swirling noise, a new voice cut through. Messieurs, mesdames. A tall, thin man in a dark coat stepped forward. He wore the look of a clerk who had spent more of his life with papers than with people. My name is Tien Morel, he said. I speak on behalf of the French consulate. He held up a folded document and passed it to Morand. The consulate has received documentation regarding Monsieur Lucien Baptiste Vaucourt, he said. We confirm his birth registration in Paris in 1829, his baptism at Glaise Saint-Sulpice, and his status as a French citizen. We have, in our possession, copies of his birth certificate naming his parents as Christophe Vaucourt, French citizen, and Klein Moreau, free woman of color, resident of Paris. Under French law, he is free. We request that this sale be suspended immediately pending a full legal review. The murmur that followed was half outrage, half fear. Morand stared at the paper, then at Adrienne, then at Lucien. If Lucien was truly free and the sale went forward, Morand could face charges. The hotel could be sued. The entire event could become a scandal of the first order. Adrienne, recovering from his first shock, yanked a packet of papers from inside his coat. Lucien's own documents, taken from the locked drawer. These are fabrications, he shouted. I can bring witnesses who knew his mother as a slave on my plantation. She died there in 1848. The boy has been filled with nonsense and now believes he is someone he is not. This interruption is an attempt to defraud everyone in this room. He had planned for this possibility, Lucien realized with a cold, sick clarity. Adrienne had known there was a risk Lucien might speak. He had come prepared with a story, witnesses, and a convenient dead woman whose identity could be stretched to cover whatever he needed. Morel was not finished. We also possess, he said, a letter written by Monsieur Lucien and delivered to the consulate yesterday. It details the circumstances of his arrival at Belle-Rivière, his uncle's seizure of his papers, and his fraudulent entry into the plantation records as property. The letter exhibits familiarity with French law, literature, and society consistent with his claimed education. Copies have been forwarded to the Louisiana Attorney General and to federal authorities. This matter is now under official investigation. Adrienne froze. A letter. Somehow, Lucien had found a way to send a letter. Morand inhaled once, sharply. Then he lifted his gavel. The auction is suspended, he declared, pending legal review. The individual in question will be removed from the block and held in secure custody until the courts render a decision. All bids are voided. No sale will take place today. Gage moved toward Lucien, but Morel stepped between them. He will be held by city authorities, Morel said, not by Monsieur Vaucourt. There is too clear a conflict of interest. 2 city constables came forward. They did not shackle Lucien, which said everything. They treated him not quite like a prisoner, not quite like a free man. Something in between. As they led him from the platform, Lucien and Adrienne locked eyes for one last moment. Adrienne's expression was a tangle of rage, fear, and something that looked almost like respect. Lucien said nothing. Everything necessary had already been said. They took him to a room in the Cabaldu, the building that housed city government and its small jail. The room had a bed, a chair, a table, and a barred window. The door locked behind him with a heavy click. For 3 days he waited while lawyers, clerks, and officials shuffled papers, took testimony, and tried to untie a knot they themselves had helped tie. During those 3 days, several things became clear. First, Christophe Vaucourt was dead. He had died in New York on May 2nd, 12 days before the auction, living just long enough to receive Adrienne's letter promising to care for Lucien. Second, the French consulate verified that all of Lucien's papers were genuine. There was indeed a birth record in Paris for Lucien Baptiste Vaucourt, son of Christophe and Klein, registered as a free birth. Third, Adrienne produced 3 witnesses who claimed to have known an enslaved woman named Klein at Belle-Rivière, who had died in 1848 and had spoken of a son named Lucien. All 3 witnesses were themselves enslaved. Their legal status did not invalidate their testimony. The legal question became a strange, cruel riddle. If Klein in Paris and Klein at Belle-Rivière were the same woman, when had she become a slave? If she had been enslaved before Lucien's birth, then under the local doctrine that a child's status followed the mother's, he was enslaved regardless of where he had been born. If she had been free at the time of his birth, or if the two Kleins were different people, then Lucien was free. No one could prove it definitively. On May 17th, Judge Theodore Thibodeau, a man known for caution and a mild sympathy toward free people of color, issued his ruling. It was a masterpiece of ambiguity. The available documents, he stated, strongly suggested that Lucien had been born free in France. The testimony from Adrienne's witnesses suggested he might also be the son of an enslaved woman at Belle-Rivière. Without the testimony of Klein herself, or additional documentation of her status at the time of Lucien's birth, no final conclusion could be reached. Therefore, the attempted sale at Maison Royale was void. Adrienne could not sell Lucien as a slave unless he could present clear proof that Lucien had been born enslaved. The burden of proof lay entirely on Adrienne. Until such proof was provided, Lucien could not be legally held in slavery. At the same time, Lucien could not simply be declared free under Louisiana law without further evidence of his mother's free status. He was, Judge Thibodeau concluded, in a gray zone, neither formally enslaved nor formally free. Practically, this meant Lucien would be released from custody. Adrienne was forbidden from claiming ownership of him. Lucien was not allowed to leave Louisiana without official permission, at least not until the matter was considered closed. The case itself was left technically open, awaiting evidence everyone quietly knew would never come. It was a ruling designed to protect everyone important. Adrienne's reputation remained intact enough that he could claim he had tried to do the right thing. The Maison Royale avoided ruin. The bidders got their money back. And Lucien stepped out of the caboodle that afternoon with his leather trunk in one hand, $8 American in his pocket, and a small bundle of papers under his arm. His own French documents had been returned. Alongside them was a copy of Thibodeau's ruling and a letter from the French consulate affirming that they recognized him as a French citizen and would assist him if they could. He had nowhere to go. He knew no one in the city. He stood on the street outside the caboodle, the heat pressing down, the sound of carriages and voices swirling around him, and felt something sharp and bright rise in his chest, fear, and beneath it, excitement. He was not safe, but he was alive. He was not entirely free, but he was no longer owned. He had survived. What happened next is where history begins to blur and legend starts to seep in. Some accounts say Lucien walked out of New Orleans that very day, heading north along the river road and never looking back. Others say he stayed for a few weeks, teaching French in small boarding schools under an assumed name, until he had enough money to leave quietly on a northbound steamer. A newspaper in Cincinnati in August 1853 carried a tiny notice seeking a French tutor named L.B. Vaucourt. It may have been him. It may have been coincidence. A year later, in 1854, the French consulate received a short letter signed only L.B., thanking them for their intervention and saying he was free and beginning again. No return address. Back at Belle-Rivière, Jonas told other enslaved workers that he had seen Lucien 3 days after the auction, walking past the plantation at dawn, dressed in rough clothing and carrying a small bundle. I called his name, Jonas would say years later. He turned, he smiled, he put his finger to his lips and he kept walking. Whether Jonas told it as it happened or gave people the ending they needed, no one can say. We do know this. Adrienne Vaucourt never truly recovered. His plantation remained profitable. Money still came in. But in New Orleans society, something in his reputation had cracked. Some families quietly cut ties. Others smiled to his face and spoke of him in low, disapproving tones behind his back. Adrien tried to sell his own blood, they whispered. He stole a free man's life and put him on the block like a chair. Whether Lucien had been legally free or not almost stopped mattering. What lingered was the sense that Adrien had crossed a line that even his world recognized as monstrous. He had put profit above family, appearances above honor. In 1859, a package with no return address arrived at Belle-Rivière. Inside was a French edition of The Count of Monte Cristo. On the title page, someone had written in elegant, familiar script, "Fils de malheur, nous sommes ceux qui portent l'or et même blessure." We are brothers in misfortune, we who carry the same wound. Adrien recognized Lucien's handwriting. He burned the book that same day in his study fireplace, but not before one of his daughters, Marguerite, saw the inscription and copied it into her diary. That diary survived. The reference was precise. The Count of Monte Cristo is the story of a man falsely imprisoned who escapes and quietly destroys everyone who wronged him. It is a story about transformation, about killing one identity and building another. Adrien chose to read the inscription as a threat. He hired men to look for Lucien. They found nothing. He doubled his security. He slept with a pistol by his bed. Over the next few years, he faded physically, mentally, spiritually faster than his age alone could explain. He died in 1862, during the Union occupation of New Orleans, at the age of 66. His doctor called it nervous exhaustion. The servants who sat with him in his last weeks told another story. They said he often spoke in French to someone who wasn't there, arguing with a boy only he could see. "I gave you shelter," he would say. "I did what was necessary. Why can't you understand?" No one answered him. Christophe's death, in contrast, had been simpler. He died in New York 3 days before Lucien declared, under the dome of the Maison Royale, "I am free." One of the nuns who nursed him said that near the end, he seemed oddly peaceful. He said, "My son is free. That's all that matters," she recalled years later. I don't know if he meant it in some spiritual sense, or if he knew something, but he seemed sure. The Maison Royale continued its auctions for another decade, but the sale of May 14, 1852 vanished from its official histories. The contracts, the bidder notes, the cancelled transaction, none of it remained in the hotel's surviving papers. As far as the hotel's records were concerned, that Friday did not exist. The story survived anyway. It was told in Creole households over wine, whispered about in legal arguments over the rights of free people of color, passed between generations as the day the beautiful slave said his own name. And here is where the story becomes truly strange. Everything we can check suggests that Lucien was telling the truth. The French consulate's confirmation was real. The Paris records exist. Christophe's marriage decline is documented. And Adrien's claim about an enslaved woman named Klein at Belle-Rivière. There is no trace of her in any surviving plantation record before Lucien's arrival. No inventory entry. No purchase. No sale. No mention in the ledgers. She appears only in Adrien's testimony and in the words of the enslaved witnesses, who testified for him, which suggests something even darker than the story already implies, that Adrien may not only have tried to enslave a free man by manipulating law and appearance, but also fabricated an enslaved woman, coached witnesses, and built an entire false history around her to justify his actions. If that is true, then what happened at Maison Royale was not just a sale gone wrong. It was the exposure of a carefully constructed fraud. And if that is true, then Lucien's disappearance becomes easier to understand. He was not only fleeing a system willing to erase him. He was fleeing a man who had already proven willing to rewrite reality to maintain his own comfort. The last documented trace of someone who might be Lucien appears in 1897. A researcher named Albert Lacombe was collecting stories from elderly Creoles for a book on French heritage in New Orleans. One woman, Madame Henriette Bouchard, 93 years old, told him about an auction she had seen as a young woman. "The most beautiful young man I ever saw," she said. "He stood on the marble block and told everyone he was free. We all thought they'd kill him for it. They didn't. They just didn't know what to do." Lacombe asked if she believed the young man's claim. "Oh yes," she said. "You could see it in how he held himself. Free people stand differently. They hold their heads differently. That boy was free. He just had to make them admit it." Lacombe asked if she thought he had escaped. Madame Bouchard smiled faintly. "I think he went somewhere cold," she said. "Somewhere his face meant nothing except that it was handsome. Canada, maybe. Or France. Or somewhere in the north where no one cared about our laws. I think he lived a long life. And I think he never told anyone what happened to him. Some stories are too dangerous to tell. You carry them until you die, and then they die with you. Maybe that's for the best." Whether she was right, we do not know, but the fact that the Louisiana legislature sealed the official records related to that aborted sale in 1853 and has kept them sealed ever since suggests that someone, somewhere, decided the full truth was still dangerous. Every request to unseal them has been denied. The official reason is always the same: privacy concerns for potential descendants. But Lucien would have been born in 1829. Any direct descendants would now be several generations removed. Those kinds of privacy concerns usually do not stretch so far, which suggests that the real reason is something else. Maybe those records contain proof of Audrienne's fraud and of the complicity of other respected families. Maybe they name people whose descendants still sit in comfortable houses and would rather not see their ancestors' crimes spelled out in ink. Maybe they contain hints of where Lucien went and who he became. Maybe, somewhere in those locked files, there is the answer everyone quietly wants. Did he really escape? Did he build another life under another name? Did he marry, grow old, and die as an ordinary man in an ordinary town? His past folded away and never spoken of again. We cannot know, but we can follow the traces. The letter to the consulate in 1854, the book sent to Audrienne in 1859, the complete silence afterward, no notice of recapture, no rumor of a man once called the most beautiful slave in New Orleans being dragged back in chains. Everything we do have points to one conclusion. Lucien slipped the net. He did not win in court, not cleanly, but he did what so few in his position were able to do. He refused to vanish. He stood on a marble platform built to turn human beings into property and said his own name. He forced a system designed to erase people like him to pause, hesitate, and write his existence down. And then, when the moment came, he walked away. Maybe somewhere in Montreal, or Boston, or Paris, or a town no one has thought to check. There is a death certificate for a man with a French name, born around 1829. Occupation: tutor, or clerk, or bookkeeper. Nothing special, nothing remarkable. But behind that quiet line on that quiet record might lie the story of Lucien Baptiste, who was once put on an auction block in New Orleans, declared himself free, and then stepped sideways into legend. Maybe that isn't even the right question. Maybe the question is not whether he escaped, or where he went, or what he did afterward. Maybe the real question is why we still need this story at all. Why, out of thousands of similar stories from that time, this one has clung to the edges of our memory. Why people still search archives, census lists, shipping manifests for his name. I think it's because his story does something rare. It shows a man who refused to disappear on someone else's terms. Most people in his position were swallowed by a system built to erase them. They left no records, no words, no names. Lucien did something different. He stood in the brightest, cruelest light his world could produce and said, "I am free." He said it knowing that it might kill him. Whether or not those words immediately changed his circumstances, they changed the story. They turned him from an object into a subject, from a thing being sold to a person demanding to be heard. And maybe that is why, more than a century and a half later, we are still telling his story. Because in the only way that truly matters, he won. He did not let them finish erasing him. He made sure that anyone who tried would have to work very, very hard to do it. And he left just enough traces, a letter, a book, a memory in an old woman's mouth, that if we look for him, we can still find him. So what do you think? Do you believe Lucien Baptiste was truly free by law as well as by spirit? Do you think he made it out? Or do you think something else happened after that locked room in the caboodle? And why would Louisiana still keep those records sealed all these years later? If there wasn't something explosive inside them, something that still matters now? Leave your thoughts in the comments. Tell me what you think happened to Lucien Baptiste Valcourt. And if you felt this story, this dark mystery from the edge of history, then subscribe to this channel, hit the bell, and share this video with someone who loves the stories that were never meant to be told. Because every view, every comment, every share helps bring the voices they tried to bury back into the light.